But what we're going to cover in this PowerPoint are the 4 dimensions of culture. And these dimensions, you may have heard of them before because this terminology is used at times. Looking at the dimension of individualism versus collectivism. Individualistic country, culture versus a collective culture. Looking at a masculine culture versus a femininity culture. Power distance and uncertainty avoidance as far as a dimension. Lastly, Hofstede and Bond, another researcher, identified a 5th value, and that's looking at long-term versus short-term life orientation. So let's look at these 4 dimensions along with Hofstede's and Bond's 5th value. Individualism versus collectivism. How people define themselves and their relationships to others. Looking at an individualistic culture. This is where the interests of the individual prevail over the group. Individualistic cultures is where the interests of the individual prevail over the culture. The needs and the goals of the individual. The individual achievements. I just got my master's degree. I just got a promotion. The identity to look after oneself. And an individualistic culture is loosely integrated. They look after themselves and their immediate family. There's a direct style of communication. And what does that tell you? That's the low context culture, low context style of communication. And cultures that are individualist include the United States, Australia, Great Britain, and Canada. In an individualistic culture, such as the U.S., one person's identity is based on what they do for a living, how they make their money, their self-identification. Very important in an individualistic country or culture compared to a collective culture. And this is where the group interests prevail, okay, as a community. The collective culture would be tightly integrated. And there's an indirect style of communication, as we see here, a high context culture. Guatemala, Ecuador, Panama are good examples. This YouTube video has a very good example of the differences between an individualistic and collective culture. Let me give you an example. A young man, let's say from Colombia, Latin America, went to the United States to become a doctor. And he studied very hard. He became a physician. And he got a PhD along with becoming a physician. He wrote a famous book. And when he came home, people were not concerned in his home city of Colombia of what he did. It was who he knew, who he was related to, who was his collective group of people in Colombia. So it's not necessarily the individual accomplishments, it's the collectivism. So individual and collectivism. Watch the YouTube video, that's really good. Japan is living in the middle. It's not necessarily individualist or a collectivist. It's in the middle of the two. It's very popular as being stereotyped as a group culture. However, Hofstede's research showed that the Japanese to be more collective or a collective type of community. However, other research found that especially young Japanese people were more individualist. They value more free lifestyle, more as an I lifestyle compared to the older Japanese society. The second area is a masculine versus feminine culture. Masculine cultures strive for a maximum distinction between what men and women are expected to do. A masculine culture stresses assertiveness, competition, material success in both men and women. So there's a difference between what men and women do. It's important to realize that in both a masculine and feminine culture, that these traits apply to both women and men. No matter which culture you live in, these traits that we talk about are for both genders. And in the feminine culture, the stress is the quality of life, interpersonal relationships, concern for the weak in men and women. A feminine culture would be Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark. Feminine cultures, there's more overlapping social roles. There's a high value on feminine traits. They stress the quality of life, interpersonal relationships, okay, compared to the masculine culture, where obviously managers, for instance, whether you're a man or a woman, doesn't mean it's a man, have to be assertive, decisive, and that there is a distinction between men and women. Thirdly, power distance. The way a culture deals with inequalities. Okay, so what we're looking at here, it's the extent in which those with less power in institutions and organizations expect and accept how power to be distributed unequally. Okay, so what does this mean? For instance, high power distant cultures, people are expected to display respect for those with higher status. Okay, countries such as Thailand, people are expected to display respect for monks with a ritual of greeting, removing hats, the seating of a monk, the higher seat. Okay, so in other words, what we're looking at is those with inequalities. So if you have status, if we're looking at equalities as far as status, the power distance of a country, for instance, if it's a high power distance, they will not, in a sense, regard those who are less of them. Maybe a socially economic status, they won't regard them as well as compared to one with a low power distant culture. You see on your PowerPoint that high power distance countries are where children are expected to be obedient. People display respect to those of higher status: Malaysia, Guatemala, Panama, the Philippines. Hofstede believes this is learned in families. The root of this is learned in the family. The parents teach the children, for instance, in a high power distance, to be obedient to their parents. So power distance and how our culture deals with inequalities. Along with that, to be familiar with the word mitigated speech, and it's differential or indirect speech communication based on differences in status. For instance, this is a linguistic term, and it describes the indirect speech in which communication between individuals is perceived as high power or of distance. So in a high power culture, one would not speak to a superior directly. He or she may, in a sense, sugarcoat the words. Okay, that's called mitigated speech. It's an indirect speech communication because you're showing respect, and it's based on the differences in status. An example is that in Korean Airlines, years ago, excuse me, in the late 80s and early 90s, they had the worst crash record. And this is because of the mitigated speech of the subordinate pilot to the senior captain pilot. So think about this. There's a senior captain pilot, and then there's a subordinate junior pilot. And the junior pilot obviously had to show respect, had to have indirect speech patterns to that of the senior captain. The junior would not challenge the senior captain's decision. They wouldn't confer on what's the best option, and because of this high power distance, there were more crashes with Korean Airlines. Again, you could watch this YouTube, which would be very interesting and helpful. The fourth area is uncertainty avoidance. Okay, and we talked about this in an earlier PowerPoint. This is the extent in which people in a culture feel threatened by the uncertain or unknown situations. Cultures strong in uncertainty avoidance are active, aggressive, emotionally compulsive, security-seeking, and intolerant, okay, because they feel threatened by unknown situations. Cultures that are weak in uncertainty avoidance are thoughtful, less aggressive, unemotional, relaxed, accepting of personal risk, excuse me, and relatively tolerant. Okay, cultures that are high in uncertainty avoidance, okay, they feel threatened. These type of cultures need rules. They need precision. They need folks to be punctual, compared to those that are weak in uncertainty avoidance, where they're more thoughtful. Religion and history play a major role in this particular orientation, not necessarily family, but the history of the culture and religion, the type of religion, where, for instance, the Roman Catholic religion is considered to be strong in uncertainty avoidance, where they're more security seeking, there's more rules in that particular religion. That's just one example. There are others too. A long-term versus short-term orientation. This is an extension of the work of Hofstede by Bond, and it includes, for instance, the culture's values such as thrift, persistence, having a sense of shame, and ordering relationships. So there's two types of cultures here. We're looking at long-term orientation, encourages thrift, savings, perseverance toward results, a willingness to be subordinate oneself for a purpose. Countries such as China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Japan. And short-term orientation is consistent with spending to keep up with social pressure. Excuse me. Less savings, preference for quick results, a concern with saving face. Pakistan, Nigeria, Philippines, Canada. Okay, so these are just some examples of different countries that have or display some of these orientations. And remember, we don't want to stereotype. We don't want to say that everybody has these types of qualities or personalities. Thank you.